Now that you have your job history put together in a chronological order, we're going to take each of your jobs that you've done and we're going to add accomplishments for those. And an accomplishment isn't a full history of what you did or a full bullet point that you would have on a resume, but rather it's the successes that you experienced. And so these are very specific in terms of the results that you achieved. And they typically say, or the recommendations that I've heard in the past are to use numbers to show the results of the work that you did, and that is good. One of the things that I noticed as I was putting my resume together, when I was getting feedback from friends and other managers, as was reviewing and getting ready to submit my resume for roles, is that the hard numbers are much better than loose numbers. So if I were to say at Quantometric, for example, led largest implementation to date, that's a lot different than saying led largest implementation with over 1 billion monthly user sessions. So having that specific number of 1 billion monthly user sessions gives a perspective of the work that I did, or the impact of the work that I accomplished at Quantometric when I was an enterprise solutions engineer. And so having those hard numbers tells the 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 key part of the success story in a way that other people can grasp and understand. So another common thing that I see is people will add percentages to their accomplishments. So they may say increased lead volume by 30% or 20%. So in this case, 20%, the question and the person reviewing your resume or reviewing your accomplishment in this case would be, well, so what? Did it go from 5 to 6? Or did it go from 500 to 600? It's very different in terms of scale and impact of the work that you did. So as you're putting your accomplishments down under the positions, make sure that you're doing it in a way that is tangible and indicates the actual impact of the work that you did. And if you are going to include something like percentages, use it as a way to clarify or modify the actual impact itself by saying, I implemented a customer with over 1 billion monthly user sessions, a 20% jump over the next largest implementation. I've gone through and added accomplishments to my job positions, and to review some of the things that I did here. All of your accomplishments don't need to have hard numbers. If you don't have that yet, it's great to have a placeholder to say something like increased delivery quality. Whenever you can quantify, the better. But for this exercise, just getting as much as you can down is really helpful. And so a few questions to consider as you're going through. So how much is enough when it comes to accomplishments? And really the answer to that comes down to how much you want to highlight each of the roles that you've had previously. So generally a good rule of thumb is your more recent experience should have more accomplishments listed, because as you go back in your history, your job history, oftentimes there's less impact that you had compared to more recent roles. And it's also distant enough that it's harder to talk about those stories and qualify them, because really what you want to do in your resume is highlight things that you'll bring up in your interview, so that way you're connecting the thread. So the purpose of a resume, if we're going back to our last lesson, is to generate interest and excitement and get the recruiter or the hiring manager to take the next step, which is to invite you into an interview. And if they've reviewed your resume, then they should know at least the beginnings of these stories. So it's almost the teaser or the trailer for the movie, or the better version of the story that you're going to tell in the interview. So now that you have your accomplishments listed, coming back to that idea again, how much is enough? So one, you want to have more accomplishments with more recent roles, and then you also want to have more accomplishments with roles that you want to highlight. So if your more recent role is something like founder, and your previous role was something like software engineer, and you want to highlight the work that you did there, especially if it was a longer stint, then have additional accomplishments listed out there, and spend more time thinking through the accomplishments that you had at that role. Another thing to do if you're struggling to come up with ideas is to just sit down and think about what feedback you got from your manager, what you were praised for, potentially any awards that you won. That's the easy one. But I think the more important one is the thing that you did day in and day out to really succeed or excel in the role that you had. And if you get to a point where you're still like, oh, I need more, and I'm not thinking of enough, go back to past colleagues, have a chat, and ask them their perspective of what you did well. And if you have contact with your past managers, that's a good way to get ideas and to continue growing on them. The next step we're going to do with these achievements or accomplishments is we're going to take them and turn them into a story, because each of the bullet points within your resume should have a very concise story that it's telling. And any good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the good middle of a story is bringing up that story, how the hero of the story got to the problem that they ultimately overcame. And so if you're able to do that in a bullet point, the highlight should be the result of what was the end of the story of the work that you did. And in order to do that, obviously in a bullet point you can't have a whole movie or a whole summary of your experience that you had at the position or telling about the achievement. But the way that we do that is starting with the end, which is what was the result, and then describing how you got there in brief terms. And a good way to think about that is, what did it take to achieve that? And so it could be a time description. So grew revenue to 7 figures in under a year. That's more descriptive than just grew revenue to over 7 figures. And so I've done that with a few bullet points here. So you see the average hiring time less than 2 weeks. So I could add some details behind it of decreased average hiring time with less than 2 weeks by revising the interview process. So what we're doing is we're starting to turn these achievements into bullet points, into a story. And with your bullet points, the more concise, the better. So typically you'll want to keep it to 1 line, and you may extend it to 2, but anything more than 1 or 2 lines is going to be too much. So what you'll do now is take each of your achievements, and doesn't have to be a full story yet, but turn it into more descriptive that explains how you got to that achievement. What was the work that you took to do that? And depending on the role that you're looking at is how you'll be phrasing this. So if you're looking for more individual contributor role, you may focus more on how you got there as opposed to the number itself. Whereas if you're looking at a business role, a management role, or a leadership role, the focus should be on the result itself. So whereas if you're an engineer saying, hey, I use these technologies in order to build this website that got a million users a month in traffic, the focus can be more on the story of how you got there. Because as an individual contributor, that's what you're doing, is you're building things to get to results, whereas leaders are focused on setting the goal. Where is the team going in order to accomplish a result? So as you're telling your story, just be thinking about the role that you're looking for and how your story is going to reflect in that role. Because ultimately what you want to do is show the recruiters and the hiring managers that will be reviewing your resume that you have the skills in order to succeed in the role that they're looking to hire for.